Next up, we're joined by Brett O'Connor, Head of Implementation and Transformation at Alexander Mann Solutions. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Hi, it's great
Thank you
to
for having me
have you.
today.
And wonderful to have you, likewise. Your topic, crossing continents and making connections in an ever-changing world, sounds fascinating enough, and I'm happy to tell everyone that Brett has a more, how should we put it? Tell me, Brett, a more keynote-like presentation, I suppose. So what that leaves me with is fewer interferences, fewer cases of stopping you in your train of thought, Brett. But tell me, why this topic, crossing continents and making connections, especially at a time when we are not crossing continents and making fewer connections?
That's a great way in, and thank you. In discussing the topic, Thomas asked me to bring reflections of working across the world, and as head of implementation in Alexander Mann Solutions, I've had the opportunity to build and lead global teams for outsourcing clients from 12 to 200 people for our clients, including HSBC, PwC, and Bank of America. And in addition, I co-chair our Diversity and Inclusion Committee for EMEA. We have a range of topics at gender, ethnic diversity, disability, LGBTIQ, social mobility. And I've had the fortune over the last 20 years to work across Europe, Asia Pacific, and the Americas. Originally from my accent, I'm from Australia, and I've had the fortune to live in London, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Tokyo, Shanghai. And this time last year, I skipped our winters to spend 2 months in Hong Kong. Currently, I call Berlin home, and I came here to finish a master's subjects in international economics at Humboldt University. And in general, with all those experiences, I have a real passion for cross-cultural communication, and we deliver more internally in AMS, and we're also mentoring our staff to be more effective across continents. So I think that's how it all came together today. And my dear colleague Zuja had originally invited me to speak from Gdansk, and unfortunately she cannot be here today. So I dedicate this speech to Zuja and her dear father. So today is about to lives enriched by crossing continents and cultures.
Brett, so not only do you have a wonderfully diverse professional background, but you also happen to have a fantastically soothing, calming voice that will have such effect on our audience. So let me leave you with our audience, and the screen is yours.
Thank you. Well, firstly, it would be lovely to be in Krakow today. I first visited 8 years ago. But I must confess I had an impending move back to Melbourne on my mind after years of working in London. I visited the old square and I was walking around the castle and I was listening to a BBC radio podcast. They were praising the then Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. She was the first female to hold this position, and she just made a powerful, unscripted speech for about 20 minutes without notes, rebutting sexism and misogyny she encountered for years. And it's a bit of a lightning rod moment. So beautiful city, Krakow, but forever when I see a picture of the castle, I'm reminded of Julia and her tormentors. And after working at Alexander Mann Solutions, led by and founded by women, it's the norm for us internally and has been for 15 years. So I was very disappointed at my homeland in that point. But I've always enjoyed returning to Krakow and getting to know my colleagues and exploring the city some more. And there's a can-do air of optimism there and a sort of renaissance and restoration to being an academic, a cultural, and an economic centre. So I hope we get to see each other again one day. So in crossing continents and making connections in an ever-changing world, I wanted to start with globalism and the impact of globalism, as its impact has been deep, its impact has been broad, and its impact will continue to reorder the world. And firstly, I just want to start with some economic trends. When I was younger in the 1980s, major Western economies, the group of seven, they represented most of the global economy. By 2020, and it's now the 20 leading economies represent 80% of the world economy, and this includes 5 key countries from Asia, 3 in Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. So we have diverse centers of leadership in the global economy now. The world has competing centers of economic and political power. Secondly, the rise of the services sector, and listening to many of the keynote speakers, a lot of us work in the services economy. 70% of GDP in the European Union is services, leaving the rest for industry and agriculture. And services are increasingly international in how they're delivered. And thirdly, I just want to touch upon technology and communication. Tools to interact globally are cost-effective and widespread now. I post on Instagram and connect people on Messenger and WhatsApp all around the world on a daily basis. We are living through a Zoom pandemic, as you touched upon before. It's a means of socializing and schooling. But all of these trends, there was a time when the future of globalization was looking promising, and at the end of the Cold War, a noted political philosopher argued that globalization and westernization were perhaps universal models for the future. 1992, I finished high school and then off to university. Bill Clinton was president. The EU was just formalized under the Maastricht Treaty. News was produced locally. Global networks like CNN were just emerging. When people moved overseas, it was hard to maintain contact. You wrote letters or sent photos. You had to keep a very detailed address book. Decades later, it is a truth universally acknowledged that globalization is having a bad run of it. Globalization has divided many people into winners and losers, generating instability and political polarization. Alas, globalization of economics is not leading to cultural convergence. Culture still matters. So hence reflections on cultural competency. Culture, and this, when I think of culture in this context, it's patterns of thinking, feeling, communicating, and behavior. It's learned behavior, and often it's the unwritten rules and codes. Culture is important to identity. People are proud of their cultures and heritage. They are interested in and positive of such discussions. Sharing what is distinctive, helping others make sense, building connections. Culture is not nationalism, although national identity can be shaped by cultural tradition. Being adept at cross-cultural competency and communication is increasingly valued at all levels of an organization, and it's no longer just a requirement for executives and senior leaders. Increasingly, it is the norm at deeper levels of the organization. Given our contemporary ways of working and the outlook ahead, we all need to be more adept at crossing not just physical borders, yet also cultural ones. In terms of
Wow.
cultural, thank you. Would you like to jump in? Any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot here about how the reality of making connections and connecting continents, communicating across continents has been made difficult over the last few months. What is the thing that you would consider is the most important overlooked part of the conversation? What would you say that
Oh,
is?
that's a great question. I think with conversation, if I reflect upon crossing cultures and being a native English speaker, and I reflect Lewis's model of culture is a triangle. It's a really great model. And you go from one corner is direct to indirect, talking to listening, emotive to patient. And I think if you map cultures across it, you end up with cool and factual Germany to warm and emotional Mexico to courteous and amiable Japan. And I think it's hugely important to create space in the conversations to share ideas. And if you come away and ask yourself, did you do all the talking? It most likely wasn't a successful encounter. And the perception for more indirect and listening cultures is that could come across as railroading. So one of my little cues is pause. Was that conversation 50-50? Was it maybe 60-40? But certainly if it was 80-20, we have a problem. I've actually muted colleagues, counted to 5 seconds, and then watched as they learned that respectful pauses between speaking just require a little patience at times to get communication going. So that's my one tip if we're on conference calls and Zoom at the moment, especially for native English speakers or Western culture. Take time to listen, be patient. One other model is Hofstede, and I think Gert Hofstede is backed by research on cultural dimensions, and it's defined as preferences that distinguish cultures from each other. And it's obviously broad within cultures, and you've got to be very careful not to slip into bias or stereotyping. But just 3 short examples is individuality versus team. Native English speaking countries are at one end of the spectrum, more individualistic. East Asia is at the other, more team-orientated. Majority of countries fall on the spectrum in between. So creating structures that work well for your teams over the globe is very important. So reward structures that reward teams in Asia perhaps land better than reward structures that reward individuals. What I say to my colleagues if you're interviewing for the first time in Asia, behavioral interviewing, the answer is likely to be we, not I, so don't mark them down. Understand why it's we. A second dimension is long versus short-term orientation, and key to understanding Confucian culture is a long-term focus, what one generation has sacrificed to the next, and then you overlay that with family obligations, the core original team. It's very important to understanding people in South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and a range of countries. Another dimension I'll touch upon is hierarchy and power difference, and this one's quite diverse across Europe, acceptance of hierarchical order. Where I'm from in Australia, socially it's an informal place. It can still be a serious place, but it's a reflection of a society shaped by waves of immigrants, everybody needing to get on. Other societies are more accepting of tradition in the hierarchical order. The UK comes to mind. So it's not placing values on that. It's just helpful to understand how the culture has evolved, and importantly with these models, trying to understand a little bit more of the perspective of the culture that you're dealing with. And one piece I find really helpful with cultural competency is you don't have to change your culture. That's not really possible. It's about understanding how you expand the zone in which you communicate, how you can expand the zone in which you engage, and how you can expand the zone in which you build connections. So the goal between people is to improve the crossover space. If both people bend towards each other, we get vastly more crossover space, and that makes communication more effective. And from the outset, I always believe in good intentions, curiosity, and a focus on respectful dialogue and balance.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you that good intentions are extremely important in practically all circumstances. Sometimes we tend to misinterpret people's intentions. Looking at intentions anyway very often helps. Professionally, I also work as a public speaking and nonverbal communication coach, mostly with leaders and executives, sometimes heads of institutions. And one of the questions that I hear quite often is, on the professional side, when you work as a conference host or congress host, people ask you, is it very different to be talking to the camera in a studio with no audience at all, no energy, no human factor, so to say? It's also sterile. You're talking to layers of quality glass in a lens in front of you instead of to people. So people ask me, how different is it? And consequently, those who ask and those who don't often find it difficult to understand how different it is to be a speaker at a virtual conference or a virtual meeting or a webinar even, compared to a live environment. So my question to you, Brett, is when we make connections, which is something very deep and multi-layered and very personal often, because, well, lots of factors come into play, like shyness, whether you're more introspective or outgoing. So when we make those connections, if you would like to advise the people who find it difficult in the normal world, so let alone now, what would be your first words? Those people who find it especially difficult to build connections and therefore feel lonely, more lonely than ever now.
Oh, that's a great question. I think in terms of, it's a great question in terms of reflecting on the virtual world versus the actual world. And I think I've lived long enough to see us swap to the virtual world. And I think it is harder to stand on a stage. And what I encourage people to do is take it step by step. And I'm not a natural public speaker in my younger years. I had to learn how to do this, and I learned how to debate. And there's a structure to debating, and that's very comforting because you learn how to put an argument forward, to master the points, to master rebuttal. So it's quite structured. And then I learned how to do training. And again, next thing I realized I could train 20, 30, 40 people. And then I was like, oh, but I've got a problem with public speaking, but I can train and I can debate. So I think for those of us who are more introverted is take it slowly, take it at your own pace. look for forums and opportunities which you know that you can excel in and build your confidence. It takes
Brett,
time.
Brett, if we could try and translate that to a company environment, in
Mm.
companies we clearly have teams, and should there be a facilitator, someone who makes this communication easier? Should there be a leader in charge of good relations in a team?
Yes, we should get you in. You'd be fantastic. And I think I think that's great. And I do think, importantly, if I reflect on Australia or the UK, where probably the extrovert is in the ascendancy, the facilitator can play a great role in terms of dampening that down. And I put a forum together for diversity and inclusion a couple of weeks ago, and we wanted global voices on the topic. And I was really keen that we have balance. We had Philippines, we had Hong Kong, we had Poland, Hungary, Germany, the UK, United States. I didn't want any dominant voice. And in our rehearsal, we practiced what was the cue for giving, we've all got to have equal speaking time, give people pauses. So, and I think that went off quite well, and we had some good feedback over it. So, a little rehearsal as well in facilitation, especially with those who are more inclined to jump in and feel that and have that energy and think, oh, no one's talking, I'll jump in, but realize, oh, actually, someone just needed a few more seconds to kind of get their words together in their head to feel comfortable to say something. So, importantly, inviting people in is hugely important, and that touches upon cross-cultural communication as well, because that's a key part in Asia, inviting people into the conversation if you realize, especially due to hierarchy or team structure, they're not getting their say.
And how do you build commitment or a sense of belonging under such circumstances as today? Because we call it an ever-changing world, but I think 2020 has taken the ever-changing
Mm.
world to the next level, has it not?
I think we have to look at ourselves first and start with put the analytical lens on ourselves. And years ago, and I owe a remarkable debt of thanks to a Dr. Margaret Burns. I joined one of her cross-cultural communication training sessions. It was called Asia Link, and it was a premier institute. And she advises governments and executives in Asia how to partner with Western countries, and conversely from Europe and Australia, how to partner with Asia. She's written a book on cross-cultural communication. But her starting point, and I think it works really well in this context, is reflect carefully on yourself. Because if you think about your background and build a framework, your education, the diversity of those you mixed with, even your religion, minority or majority to the society, your ethnic background, minority or majority, your gender, are you female in a society that values men more, sexuality, are you a dominant language or do you have a community language? And is your professional journey, is it in sync, in divergence with your family and community? And I give you example one, I'll give you two examples. Dr. Margaret Burns herself, she grew up as a Catholic in a Protestant part of Edinburgh, Scotland in the 1950s. She went to Oxford University, very much an establishment institute. She mastered French. She travelled extensively in Asia. She married an Australian and moved to Sydney in the late 1970s. So she's had a lot of outsider experiences. And what she identified is there's a correlation to being an outsider and an affinity for cross-cultural communication, creating awareness to take a step back from a situation, to put yourself in other people's shoes and learning to build rapport from the outside. All is not lost if you're more of an insider. You must put more work into it. And I give you an example too, a senior banking executive. Let's call him Matthew. Matthew is struggling to be effective in his new remit in Asia. Matthew grew up in England, outside of London. At school, everyone was similar background and religion. University was not very far from home and only learnt English. He had rapid career promotion in London, in the city of London with similar people. He moved to Australia at an executive level role in a bank operating across the UK, Australia, and Asia. So he realized at that moment the light bulb went off. He's a classic insider. He realized how technically proficient he was, yet how much he was struggling to adapt his communication approach, his team management approach, his listening, how he was misinterpreting the codes and the cues in Asia. So my takeaway is simple. It's very good to be uncomfortable, to be the outsider, no matter how frustrating at times. These new experiences help us to grow. So I grew up rather conventional. My parents are different religions. Same again with my grandparents. I went to university away from home, a quarter of the students. were from Asia and we were living on campus together. I learned Indonesian. I undertook a summer exchange to Japan. I have undertaken multiple work assignments in Asia. Now in Berlin, to, I guess, rephrase Mark Twain, life is never too short to learn German, and it has helped me enormously to integrate into life in Germany, to pick up the cultural nuances. I'm not elegant, but I'm still learning and I can get by. And language is really important because it's got patterns of culture, word order, and thinking that convey powerful messages. I think you understand a lot more about German engineering excellence when you understand the precision of the language. The greatest advantage of native English speakers is the global economy is open to us without ever having to master another language. The greatest weakness of the native English speakers is no compelling motivation to master another language. So I encourage everyone to try. It's good for everybody to be the outsider at times.
Brett, it's been wonderful to have you with us. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing a deeply authentic and personal perspective. And I suppose one of the most thoroughly enjoyable sentences you will leave us with is life is never too short to learn German.
To learn
Ladies and
German.
gentlemen, Brett O'Connor, Head of Implementation and Transformation, Alexander Mann Solutions. Hopefully, auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen. Tschüss.
Thank you, Brett. Cheers.